Vitoria. Vitoria, quote, was a leading 16th century theologian at Spain's Salamanca University. He drew up moral guidelines for respecting the property, lives, and souls of the indigenous Americans that helped establish principles of modern international relations. Vitoria arose as a prominent voice of check and balance amongst the greed of the colonial empire. That is, as long as indigenous people remained outside the jurisdiction of the sovereign. Even a voice with the best intentions can inspire ill-formed desires. In his work on the evangelization of unbelievers, Vitoria unpacks his response to the question of forceful conversion. Vitoria states, and this is a lengthy quote, "I reply by asserting, first, that to compel those who are subjects of the state or sovereign is not intrinsically evil, like perjuring an oath. That is, it is not so evil that it cannot sometimes be a good deed. It is evil, as St. Thomas says, but not so evil that it can never be good. The proof being that it is not by definition so evil as to involve an inevitable breach of charity to God or one's neighbor. It is not contrary to God's interest. It is clearly a great advancement of the Christian religion, nor is it against our neighbor's interests, since it is to his benefit." In this response, we see Vitoria compromising the Christian mission to make and grow with and alongside disciples, not converts, for a gospel that caters to the efficient drive to control, comprehend, and direct the other's belief. Stemming from the above quote, one line in particular haunts me, as I'm sure it does you. "It is not so evil that it cannot sometimes be a good deed." This moral point is characteristic of what Jacques Ellul calls la technique. This term encapsulates a lot for Ellul, as we've heard over these past couple hours. But the core of technical thinking is its necessary drive towards absolute efficiency for a given stage of development in every field of human activity. In short, this manifests as the treatment of the other person, of the environment, or even of myself, becoming subject to the mission at hand. The Christian theologians of Vitoria's day promulgated this technical theology by turning to efficiency and mass production as standards for conversion procedure to secure souls for both the Christian faith and the colonial empire. Pursuing this point further, the results of conversion by coercion are quite literally the opposite of Vitoria's attempted paternalism. Vitoria states, nor is it against our neighbor's interest, since it is to his benefit. This line of thinking matches exactly with Emmanuel Levinas's diagnosis of the ills of Western thought. In this way of thinking, quote, individuals are reduced to being bearers of forces that command them. The meaning of individuals is derived from the totality. The unicity of each present is incessantly sacrificed to a future appealed to bring forth its objective meaning, end quote. From this insight, we can see exactly what Vitoria is falling prey to. What benefits the other is what I deem to benefit myself, especially as I look toward the future. But by doing this, I disregard what is to his benefit on the other's own terms. Why do this? Because the drive to efficiency, the mass conversion of all non-believers on legal and moral grounds, forces me to quickly grasp at and totalize the other for the sake of comprehension, malleability, and ultimately the complete submission to my own or my own acknowledged authority. In her monograph, The Touch of Transcendence, theologian Myra Rivera renders the same point in another cultural and temporal location when she recounts, in the context of the Protestant missions that accompanied and coincided with the U.S. invasion and occupation of Puerto Rico in 1898, a missionary writes the following directive. To know the mind of God is the first requisite of the missionary, but next to that he must come to the knowledge of the mind of the people over whom he shall be placed by the Holy Spirit. According to Myra Rivera, knowledge here is an attempt to grasp, to comprehend, to gain control over people. End quote. In striving for this efficient control, rooted in la technique, one necessarily constructs abstract knowledge, which directs a conforming violence at the other and ultimately disfigures their very appearing. This disfigurement is the very annihilation of the potential for discipleship and relationality, and the undoing of what the gospel claims of the kingdom of God. Conversion, then, in technical theology, only serves as a political identifier or a forced cultural narrative constructed upon totalizing knowledge for the converted and the oppressor alike, an empty, impotent rendering of the gospel, to say the least of the matter. This colonial epistemology takes technical shape in many forms, but for the sake of casting this notion in a more tangible conceptual rendering, I will propose a model concerned with the technique of statistics. Vitoria states above that the pursuit of coercive conversion is, quote, not contrary to God's interest. It is clearly a great advancement of the Christian religion. Techniques require sustenance to thrive, and Vitoria's proffering of the notion of advancement introduces our ill-conceived technique to its proper feeding ground. To determine progress in conformity to a criterion of measurement, there must be a method of data procurement and assessment, a means of differentiating between the insider and the outsider, myself and the rejected other, or, of course, my Victoria's cause and those that are ignorantly or consciously aware of their existence as opposition. This method is, of course, statistics. Statistics are, as Ellul defined them in the Technological Society, the instrumentalities for determining raw facts. While I agree and take up this literal definition, we will expand statistics here to also signify an attitude one adopts in perceiving the world around them, by allowing oneself to be fundamentally shaped by these instrumentalities. This attitude, I suggest, is not unlike David Lovekin's reading of technique as a form of intending. Lovekin writes, many readers fail to understand technology, la technique, as a form of consciousness. But precisely this thesis is the central concern of the Technological Society. When this statistical attitude is present, individuals, communities, and whole societies end up constructing and disseminating the totalizing knowledge that Myra Rivera identifies above. This totalizing knowledge engenders a vicious and brutal myth that has haunted us moderns for some time now. Ellul describes it thusly, quote, "The technician's myth is simply man, not you or I, but an abstract entity. The technician intones, we strive for man's happiness, we seek to create a man of excellence." And here, Ellul's condemnation rings true. Quote, "The abstraction, man, in his supposed happiness or excellence, is only an epiphenomenon in the Marxist sense, a natural secretion of technical progress." This myth, then, is a false transcendence that enables those who accept it to condense the individual personhood of others into a totalizing, abstract state. The philosopher Michel Onfray names and decries the same phenomenon. Quote, "Men replaced by abstractions, statistically counted like animals and counting for much less. Men given over to the insensible become themselves insensible, whose eyes are as empty as a fish's, devoted to false knowledge, reduced to empty shells, to empty heads." Not only does this serious error justify and engender violence against its unfortunate target, but it also acts as a viral infection, contaminating all those who succumb to the co-option of desire by efficiency, reducing all persons involved to insensibility and spiritual death. I am reminded here of the contemporary transgressions committed against indigenous peoples, especially parents and children in Canada, who between the years of 1876 to 1996 had to constantly confront the fear of being abducted from their homes and put into the state-funded church-run Indian residential school system, at which it is estimated nearly 6,000 children died, often being buried in unmarked graves. In a simpler but similar case, between the years of 1910 to 1970, government officials in Australia rounded up children, especially those of mixed white and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander ethnicity, and sent them to boarding schools and church-run missions. As many as 1 in 3 indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families nationwide. I'm sure that Vitoria's dearest dictum, "It is not so evil that it cannot sometimes be a good deed," had much influence on the supposed Christian thought that led to these atrocious actions and outcomes. Christian mission, as it has occurred in many contemporary situations, is still founded upon the necessary totalization and abstraction of the other, arising from the drive toward efficiency and control, much like many other processes of relationship in our contemporary society. From the argument above, it is clear to see that the predominant Christian interpretation of the directive to make and grow disciples of every nation needs critical reevaluation as we push further into postmodernity and the technological society. How could a Christian go about doing this? The first step, surely, is to begin by listening to voices like Levinas that direct the Christian back towards the letting be other of another's otherness. Another direction may be to return to the word discipleship. What does this word mean? Discipleship has something to do with approach, justice, and dignity. In this regard, philosopher Enrique Dussel has an insight to offer. To approach injustice is always a risk because it is to shorten the distance toward a distinct freedom. Approach takes on a new meaning than those of us embedded within a necessity, efficiency-driven culture might expect. This approach is the adoption of what Ellul calls non-power. According to Ellul, quote, "Non-power means being able and not willing to do it. It is choosing not to exercise domination, efficiency. It is relinquishing power," end quote. This approach then does not mean to come near to the other for the sake of knowledge that engenders control, possession, domination, or exploitation. Rather, this approach is the separation of the same from the other. the turn towards the opening of infinity, away from totality and its disastrous results. Results that the indigenous populations, both prior in history and contemporaneous to us, must strive to overcome. The philosopher Felix Omercada expresses this approach in terms of Christian agapeic love, stating, "I am not the object of my love in any form. There is no notion of becoming one in love. In love, the other, remains beyond the reach of my love." Omercada, offering an elucidation of the existential realization of this agapeic love, elsewhere reminds us, quote, "The proper conception of the movement of agapeic existence is a movement beyond the practical, beyond the instrumental, toward a being in relation to the other. This agapeic love is an undoing of efficient technical intentions, which once undone, unfolds and reveals the image and presence of Christ in the simultaneously transcendent and immanent space given by the distance between the particularities of oneself and another." This is risky, as Dussel realizes, because there is vulnerability upon this approach. My distinct freedom is limited because I now must submit to the other in response. As Dussel indicates, to greet or injure, to embrace or murder. The other's distinct freedom is limited by their decision in response to the encounter. Unlimited freedom, especially as it concerns our potential to totalize and seek efficiency from within the abstract statistical attitude, is interrupted and redirected to the particularity of the other for the sake of justice. This is relationship. This is discipleship. Put another way, Omercada observes, Christian life is a being with existence who are singular responses to a loving call. Such a being with, such a tarrying with, is a silent acknowledgement of shared being, called in the agapeic being of creation, a being that subverts all erotic appropriation. Read here, La Technique manifested in the statistical attitude. This is the gospel's directive, to approach and tarry with the other in patient justice, and to turn one another towards Christ's witness of mercy, righteousness, and dignity, all in the name of denying what is efficient, all for the sake of radical love and liberation, which only arrives through the denial of technical thinking itself. Ellul captures the most critical form of this denial when he reminds us, quote, "In a world aimed at power by technique, only the spirit and the behavior of non-power are the critique." In conclusion, there is no spectrum for evil and goodness. There is no evil deed of transgression that yields a good for another's own benefit. As Vitoria would have us believe, there is only discipling one another in the gospel, approaching and tarrying with one another in honesty, justice, and submission. This is what the efficient theology of Vitoria distorts. Technical theology totalizes all entities into the singularity of oblivion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation.